We're back with another episode of P5Live Sessions. Today, I think we are going to simply play with circles with divided by 2, height divided by 2, 200. Today in class we spent a big chunk of it just playing with push and pop matrix and translate and rotate, both in a 2D and 3D realm. And so after spending a couple hours playing with that stuff, showing how it works, I think it'll be nice just to have kind of a decompression and play with the things myself. Curious, what can I do just with a circle, playing with it spinning around, or doing maybe eventually going into 3D space and having a bunch of these things maybe going in different directions. Just messing with push and pop matrix. So will be accidentally educational while I just mess around with some code for the next hour, starting off with a circle. So let's quickly get that thing changed. Question of how big it should be. I'll start somewhere around there. And probably I immediately want to have something spinning around or moving. So I'm going to do a rotate radians frame count. But actually I don't want it spinning around the 0, 0 in the upper part. So I'm going to translate it immediately. And instead draw this circle at 0, 0. If I recompile, oops, we're rotating first. We need to translate first. And now we're technically spinning, although I can't see it, unless I offset this thing a little bit. And then I get some nice like orbiting motion. Because first I'm moving myself to the center, then I'm rotating, and then I'm offsetting from that perfect spinning place. I'd also demonstrated using angle mode degrees, and that way I don't need to use these radians. I'm really used to using radians, especially playing with sine. I use those values, but it's also interesting to go to this and not have to cut all these numbers down as much as I normally do. So one is spinning in the center. Maybe I put another one outside of that center. I think I'll make a variable so I don't have to keep typing in the number 300 a bunch of times, and then I can change my mind and test out some different sizes. Turn off background for a minute. I always like tracing this image out, or just tracing images out in general. It's the easiest way to just see the path of motion, see the way things move, and build up a composition without a lot of crazy complex code, just letting it do its thing and leave a mark behind. So that's a single donut, we could call it. And if I had another, I could just keep pushing this thing off of the center axis where we're hanging out. But now it's interesting actually, letting these things, I should use a loop instead of copy pasting, although that's like a really quick way for testing this out. What does it look like if they are smaller? All right. Yep, but I should use a loop because all I'm doing is multiplying here by a digit. So let's get rid of all of this and say let LC for loop count be, let's make 5 of these things. Make a small loop and put that ellipse inside of there and say it's S times I. And then I need to get rid of some of these. I need the rest of the values, 0 and S. There we go. So now I'm actually don't need this initial one. That can go away as well. Make the code a little bigger if it helps. And now I could have 15 of these things and make them way smaller. too small. Yeah, interesting just to see what kind of pattern that leaves depending on how far out it is from the center. How big is that gap between each one based on how fast it has to move to keep up with the other lines. If I either make them bigger or have more, then I can make it all the way to the edge. All the way to the edge. Let me go make 20 of these things. And I think what also needs to happen, be interesting to let their rotations go a bit faster and slower than one another. It might also be interesting to say no fill and say the stroke is actually white. Start it off on a fresh screen. Still worth playing with the speed at which we're rotating here. Losing my voice after talking throughout the day. So that's slowing it down. Actually, I kind of want to do the opposite and speed it up and see what it's like if the gaps between these circles are even further apart. Just going to test out a couple numbers, number tweaking, and see. Yeah, it's quite interesting how it hits a perfect, it always seems here to land on the same spot. So those holes are just overlapping. Maybe it's interesting. Maybe it's always going to do that. Interesting. But that's interesting to let them overlap if I play with a 4 and then I play with a 5 and then we get kind of these rings and then I play with a 6 and let some of these things add up and add up and add up versus refreshing, recompiling. It's a cheap way just to be able to start everything over. Control Enter. I can recompile. Yeah, not a whole lot is happening, but I'm easily amused with what I see there. But I'm interested. I'm going to slow the thing back down, and I'm interested to see what happens if I can make these circles kind of go at different speeds instead of all following each other. Maybe they start to push and pop or push and pull with that general rotation. So everything is rotating now, and it's a question, if I move that rotation from here down into the loop, now everything froze. If I just drop it in, we get crazy rotations, and that is because it's rotation on top of rotation on top of rotation. Each time this loops, it's like building up that much more on top of the other. Interesting to turn on the background rather, and see what this thing looks like, whipping around, creating arabesque-like patterns. If we made these things small enough, yeah, can leave a trace or not. It's interesting to see both. Hard to decide, but that is having everything rotate on top of each other, and so it's a little bit harder to control. Instead, I'm going to push and pop. And now they have no idea about the rotation of each other. They are all just being told, hey, this is how we're supposed to rotate. So maybe I say times I just to make some go faster. Okay, that does the same thing. But if I had frame count plus I times 4 D. Yeah, then I get to play with there being a change between each of these copies. So this creates an interesting, almost like I'm building an Ajax loader. Wait for the page to load, wait for it. Could make it go in the opposite direction. Just use a negative here. And now we get more like a revealing. Maybe I need a background with some transparency, and then this thing just makes like a nice spiral. Bursty, too much, 15. Maybe 10, leave an even longer trail, just letting this thing trace its image out. That's kind of fun. Interesting to test out having fewer of them, but let them be far bigger. What does that look like? I'll go back and keep working at this size. Yeah, so that's them all moving at the same speed, but having an offset to each other. So we can make it even tighter circle if it's an even larger amount that they're offset. That gets interesting. This is going to be the hypnotic show. But I'm going to get rid of all that and make them, I'm going to hold it off on the side. It was interesting to play with. I kind of want to play with this. Now it's like a radar screen. It's probably going the wrong way. I think it's supposed to go that way, clockwise. And play with there being some difference between each of these things. So they're all moving in the same rotate, and maybe I need a way to tell them to rotate a bit further in front and behind one another. Yeah, maybe I do plus and use a sign in there so that they're kind of going plus minus a certain amount. Maybe this needs to be like I as the offset times 50. But if I do, this might be not so different. No, it will be different because now this is making like a wave form essentially. It's still not what I was after, but it is interesting. If I make the size way smaller and add even more of these things, that I can see what that wave looks like. Change the directions. Maybe I just want to do a minus. I don't know if that made a difference. But they don't really look like they have a lot of life because they are all moving together. They need to have, different amounts of movement to one another. So I think I'm going to go back to there just being like this continuous rotation, and then maybe play with, it technically shouldn't make a difference to add or just do another rotate, but I'm going to see what this is like if it's the exact same thing. But then what if I said like a frame count plus this? It's the exact same thing, but then I can just turn on and off this section without having to highlight carefully and whatnot. So I'm just doing an extra rotation on the previous rotation. Change to a minus and see what that does. Wow, that's making an interesting wiggle of a tail in a way. Plus 5. Yeah, now it has a kind of momentum whipping effect. Almost looks like some kind of pendulum. If I did a 0.5, then this thing is just kind of a piece of spaghetti flying around. It has a little bit of limberness to it. What if I go to even higher numbers? So at like 15, I could see the wave. At 25, I can still kind of see a wave. At 35, it's not as clear that the wave is there, but we can see that the things are moving in such a way. Maybe I'm going to turn off stroke for a minute. No stroke. And just test out the possibilities of the exact same code, just looking a little bit different. It's interesting where they become dots, kind of like the side of a Technics turntable, or where they're super close to each other. Then leave this smooth, so it's almost like it should be one or the other. They should either all have to make a smooth thing or become dots. And maybe I just go 10 and see what it's like when these things are... That didn't make a difference, it just made everything smaller. So that's something about maybe their size here. What if I divide it by 2? Then all the motion is all the same, but they're just not able to touch. Times 2. What do these look like when they overlap? A car wheel slowly spinning around. Let me make this thing even larger to see what it's like with an absurd number. I think all kinds of wild patterns happen here because it's doing some kind of a sine wave, but it's with such a high amount between them that actual wave isn't visible anymore, and it ends up creating just some things whooshing after other things. What does that mean? Something's whooshing after other things. I don't know. They're just at different speeds. Keep playing with other numbers. Ooh. And then hit all these lucky relationships between numbers. Now I'm at 245. I bet it's just like rolling back, and this might be the same as putting in 45 or 50, but getting these relationships that match nicely with each other. Let me turn off the background entirely and let this leave a trace, and we're going to white out the screen. So we need to change the color somehow. Either I need to bring back that stroke and let it leave this little trace, but that looks like a processing P5 circle. It looks like a little punch out dot. So maybe it is nice without a stroke, but making each one have a bit of a color that changes. If I simply say fill and something like frame count modulo 255, then we get to fade from white to black at different rates. But we have this abrupt cut because it's like a saw wave. Maybe this is also a place where they're all changing at the same color right now, so I needs to find a way in there. So I'll go I times 15 plus, just to give some offset, so they're at different speeds with one another, changing at different rates. Maybe that's working. Maybe I need a parenthesis here. Probably. But using frame count modulo in the fill usually isn't so smooth because you get this harsh cut from its top value back down to the small value. So a sine wave is usually a bit smoother, nicer to use here. I'll do frame count. Will probably change pretty fast, but we're in angle mode, so it's not so bad. We need to absolute value that. And I need to get I in there. So now they have a different offset with each other. Some are going faster, slower than the others. These are all really tiny dots. Let's check them out. Big again. Yeah, and interesting what happens with those ones that are moving faster at the edges. They don't leave such a smooth pattern behind just because they're trying to catch up with the others. So it's almost like their speed should be slower if they're further outside, and then they'll leave a smooth track like the others. If I go back to this larger thing and I turn off this other crazy rotation and we go back to this radar, that's interesting, just turning stuff on and off. That's what our fill is doing. If I tweak these numbers, then we get to see a different relationship of when those fill colors changed. Let me change it to an 8. So now it should be, yeah, just some other relationship. I can speed the thing up. I'm used to having to slow it down, but now that we are in angle mode degrees, I get to throw larger numbers into the sine wave and into the rotate. 13, wild spiral vision. 20, let this thing just go really nuts. And I should be careful for anyone epileptic flashing warning out there. Tiny flashes, so it shouldn't be triggering, but I'll slow the thing down so it's just kind of leaving an interesting pulse. It's doing this wave. I'm going to make it a negative and see if I can get it. There we go, going the opposite way. So instead of going inward, it's coming from the inside to the outside. Save once or twice these images. Have to remember to save moments while this is happening. Make it a bit larger. Okay, but I want to play with trying to get those ones on the outside to be as smooth as the ones on the inside. And I think that's about having to slow down their rotation just based on them being further out. So I could say something like minus I times 10. I'm sure there's a great formula or so that would slow it down just the right amount. But I'm just going to play with some numbers and see if and how much these things should slow down. And that creates a crazy surprise. I don't like the ones on the far outside, so I'm going to make these things way bigger. Maybe even bigger. So we can just sort of zoom into the shape and check out those ones on the inside. Maybe it's also nice to give them some opacity so that they're not too harsh, but leaving like a fade over one another. That's probably too much. There we go, that's softer. And go way to a small number just to see what happens. All right, and change our mind and check it out with a bunch of them. Yeah, that creates an interesting rope-like structure, some kind of knotted form. Gives this impression of weaving in a way. What happens if I keep it where it was and mess with these numbers here? It's not getting as bright as I would like, maybe just because this should be like up to 20. There we go. And what if this is a way higher number? 12. Right, that's about how often those gaps happen. If I go 20, similar but different, not a whole lot different. Okay, but back to, I was still curious how to deal with this rotation. Go back to our stroke thing. And I need to slow the ones on the outside down. Is this that way? Definitely not that way. What if I do minus? No, I need frame count itself to be a smaller number. This has to actually get cut into a smaller number. I can't divide by I because I start at 0. But maybe I need to go, I don't know, times I divided by 5. I don't know. Interesting. Maybe I need to, I know how many things I have. LC minus I. That is not it. Oops, I wanted a division. Yeah, also not it, but just something else. Nope. No idea what I'm doing. Just playing with some numbers. Okay, I was optimistic I could slow those things down, but I don't think I can, and instead I'd rather play in some other way with this form. Because maybe it's nice to go back to just this plain old rotation when everything was rotating like a radar. I'm gonna make fewer that are bigger. We only need 30 of these things or so. And I'm curious to mess as well in a 3D space, because we've been looking bird's eye view on this thing the whole time. And what is possible if we play somehow looking with perspective or doing other kinds of rotation? So let's see, I'm going to go WebGL. Actually, before I do this, I'm going to save this sketch and give it a clever name. Let's call this radar and clone. And now I'll switch into WebGL mode. Throws the coordinate system off. I can stop translating. Now we're back in the center. And it's always nice to do an orbit control, just so I have the ability, if I want, to spin. And there we can see the thing in 3D. So it's really cool being able to go right from a bird's eye view to perspective. So now we have this radar. If I turn, we lose our alpha channel. That's a bummer. We only have the ability if we want to leave a total trace. So then it's good to get back stroke back on so that I don't totally erase the screen or white out the screen. That's interesting, just lifting it up and down, playing with orbit control at the right way to leave some shapes. Bird's eye view, I'll bring back our background. And maybe I want to keep it with some perspective while I keep messing with this. So I'm going to do a rotate X 45. Maybe even more. Too much. There we go. Now we get to see some perspective the whole time. I can hear my fan kicking on a little bit. It's super happy that we're in 3D right now. And I want to play with letting these things do some wobbling up and down, because right now they're all on this flat plane, but we're in 3D space, so we can do some translating on not the X, the Y, but the Z axis. And let's get some wave action. Frame count times 5 or 15. And technically, these are all moving together, so they should, if I maybe hide the background, if I hide the background, then I should see them kind of wobbling up and down a little bit, but it might be so slow. There it is, you can kind of see it there. It also seems like we lost the center positioning that we had. But in any case, we need to get I in there to make each one different. I plus, with holding down shift on the wrong key. I times 5. That's why we're offset. We need to do this, do we need to do this rotate before we talk to any of this stuff. Does that make a difference? There we go. That looks more correct. Maybe it's the exact same. I think it's the exact same. But it's actually helpful turning it off to see what's happening there. And I can just tell I need a higher number here. Ah, man. Well, yeah, with the angle mode degree, all of the numbers that I'm used to are different. They're easier to work with. We don't have to do radians and all these things. But the values are totally different. And now it's building this interesting kind of pipe-like, it's gone. It was making a pipe-like structure. Let's let the whole thing spin around again. I should change my perspective a couple times and let it trace out with that being the view. Oops, Control A, live coding we want on. See what it's like with this view. And recompile to put it back at the beginning. I'm going to put the background back on and start playing with other shapes. Actually, before I play with another shape, I'm going to rotate these circles once to give them more of a 3D feeling. If I rotate their X, I times 15 or something like that. Now each one has a twist to it, but stuck in that rotation. So I can do that plus frame count and get it animating. And now we have this twisting ellipses. Yeah, why not 3D shapes? That's a great question. I'm going to go in that direction. First, still playing with this 2D and now in this 3D environment. So this is what it's looking like with that rotation off, that perspective off. And let's turn off the background again. It's leaving something else. Some of those are cutting into each other in not such a nice way, but leaving interesting artifacts. Just test out the different rotations. X is Y is Z. With a minus. Okay, but back to X was a nice just flipping of these disks. Can swap to a rectangle and play with folding squares, but of course, because we're in 3D world, we should play with 3D spaces, 3D primitives and take advantage of what those can do. So if I turn everything off and draw a box at S size, bwomp, 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 it all stopped because I was able to draw this thing with this offset. So actually we just have to draw this offset for each shape, and it's interesting to play with this being in the translate. And I have a feeling it's going to do two different things. Here I have it in the translate before I rotate, and I want to try it again after I rotate. So if I toss that and say translate paste 0, looks to be the same, but I have a feeling something is different, but maybe not. Maybe it makes absolutely no difference because of the type of rotation I'm doing. Maybe because it's an X rotation, a vertical rotation. Yeah, so here I think it would make a huge difference if I translated before or after. This Y was getting all wild. If I turn that off and put this back up here, there, then I get the rotation happening in place with the Y or the Z. Or the X. Yeah, the X is nice because those things aren't breaking each other's space. I like that they all sit next to each other. I can make the size way bigger. We don't need as many of them. They're still sitting super close to each other, so maybe they should get extra far apart from each other. And hide the background for a minute and see what kind of images we trace out cube landscape. We can make these things small again. Even smaller. What do little cubes look like with a ton of them? Yeah, in P5Live, we can do soft compiling, which is really fun. So I can just change these values and keep whatever I'd been tracing there. It doesn't have to recompile the whole sketch. It only compiles the draw. So we can change the numbers as we go and leave slightly smaller, slightly smaller, slightly smaller shapes behind. Until we get down to the voxel size. Now we have little voxels hanging out there. I'll clear it and just see what a couple of those things look like. We can get even smaller. I guess a voxel should be like a 1 by 1 pixel box, but with a stroke we probably wouldn't even see it. There is potentially a voxel. If I turn off the stroke, look at that thing go. I can try making a bunch and see what the computer thinks. I might need to spread them further out from each other. You might not see anything out there on the tube because of how fine these particles are. They're leaving quite a cool trace behind. Maybe we'll make a two pixel voxel. Interesting how it's like finishing and leaving this static image behind because everything is just kind of lining up at just the right amount, which means some of these numbers should maybe have an odd value. And then they'll constantly change and change and change. I guess it's wherever I have the sine plugged in. Nope, everything is still perfectly synchronized. So there's probably the need for more rotation on there. This is with larger cubes. Maybe I go back to playing with this fill that was giving them, that was colorizing them over time. Oh, we had an alpha channel that's not working so well. I'll get rid of that. There we go. Leaving these pulses in space. I can tweak and move the space around. They're getting a little too far apart. I think it's nice to bring them back near each other. That's even too far. Oh, that's the rotate. Wrong value. It was this guy up here. To have them sit way closer to each other again and leave this trace behind. What does this look like? Can slow everything down to leave a longer trace behind. Yeah, leaving some interesting wavy textures there. Control C, I can hide my cursor if I don't want that thing showing up. Combing the desert with grayscale cubes. Taking a snapshot every once in a while. I should be cloning the sketch more often. It keeps changing and going into all different directions. I should just be hitting the clone button and renaming what the previous one was to keep track of them or look at them later. I'll make some of these things a bit smaller and put them next to each other. I space them out, but what's it like if they're really filling up that space and leaving image behind? And then maybe I should bring back that rotation I had at the beginning that was doing some wild patterns, unexpected patterns spinning around. Let's leave traces from a cube. We don't have lights or anything on. It could make it amazing. It could ruin it. Let's give it a try. Lights. Because we're in 3D. Ooh, look at that shading. Yeah, it's fun just having these cubes kind of melt and leave a texture behind as they spin. Something that might be fun is to throw a normal material on them. It'll override our fill just to go with some wild coloring. Normal material. Is it material? Materials? What is it? Material normal? Material normal. I forget. Killed it. Check the reference. Material, normal material. Why didn't that work? You just say normal material. Maybe I mistyped it. Whoop. Hide the references. Control R, you can show and hide the references. There we go. That's normal material. It's on a different trajectory than it was before. I'm going to start it over and keep it on that same path spinning around. Normal material is super fun. It's applying a shader of this texture, or this color rather, so that we can really see these different angles of lights. It's super fluorescent. It's interesting to apply some texture to these things, but it's fun just keeping them simple colors and seeing what kind of images get traced out. Okay, that was fun. Back to the fill. And I'm going to turn off my perspective rotation again and go back to the overhead view, because I want to play with those rotations again from earlier. First, we're going to let this thing trace out once to get a view from this angle. Yeah, it's an interesting metallic quality, especially in the center. Some really nice metal shaving towards the edges. It loses it from that distance. These things are getting a little too far from each other. Later on, I'll have to figure out what needs to happen to slow these things down. You would lose that radar quality because they'd have to move just at a different speed. But it would be nice to get the same shading as towards the center. Yeah, but what happens if I turn some of these things back on? Some of them were going crazy. Ooh, this was the nice one that did these sine waves. So now these things are like dancing back and forth across each other with this huge number, 245 or 145, something like that. I'll have to slow it down again. Maybe I clear it once and see what an image just of these looks like. If we can tell the difference. Of course, it's nice to turn the background back on, change our perspective, and enjoy the 3D-ness of these cubes floating in air. Doing some crazy stuff. I'm going to move. Oh yeah, this was this huge 245. Let's go way back down to just a smaller number. Ooh, the snake. Maybe I need to make these things smaller so I can see what that looked like again. So we saw this earlier, but now it's in 3D cube form. Yeah, it really looks like it has this organic wobbling. Hard to tell that it's going to repeat that exact movement over and over and over. Feels like wind or something could be controlling it. Let's let that leave a trace. Which in the end is a bit similar to what we saw a while ago with ellipses. But there's artifacts in there that show that this was a cube. I have there's the cursor. Especially around these regions, it's leaving a kind of rounded wall. What if they were spheres? what if they were low poly spheres? 5 by 5 or 4 by 4. I bet my computer will be happy to put less detail on those spheres. Haven't played at all with the size getting bigger as we go further out. That would also take care of that issue of the gap between them. If they're not all the same size, but with some relation getting bigger and bigger and bigger as we go further. So let me say S map equals map. I comes in. It goes to LC minus 1. I'm going to have it go from S to maybe just 2 times S. And now I'll use the mapped version there. And maybe I go back to boxes just to see it a little bit clearer. Box, S map. And turn off the rotation for a minute. What does this thing look like going around? I think that's not enough. I think these should be even bigger, like 4 times as big. So if LC, because I'm also drawing a ton of them, if I only draw 50 of these things or even 20, there we go. It's going from small to large at the edge. Maybe the spacing now has to be this S map, so maybe it's good to move the S map way up higher in the code so that I can use that as well for how far apart these things should sit from each other. S map. Divided by 2. Testing things out. Times 10. Or even 20. And maybe they should rotate in the opposite direction with that. Whoops. I can do that. Minus. Get them spinning in the opposite way. Well, I guess we'll leave a different structure. Now they're going to leave, yeah, something different. Change my perspective. We are inside of it for a second. Turn my background back on. Change the aesthetic of this thing entirely by switching to strokes instead of fills. What happens if this is a stroke? Changing fancy colors, and I say no fill, and then we can really see through the thing. And we get this outline quality. What does that look like to trace an image behind with? And now we're getting into some more moire patterns. And this is where it's fun to take advantage of WebGL and artifacts by saying the stroke weight is super small, 0.25. Retracing, and I'm gonna crush the video compressor of YouTube. It's not gonna be happy with all these little artifacts. They look great on my end. They don't look great, but they look, they have a really nice grain to them. So sorry about that if compression just took a dive. But I'll save some pictures. Maybe later I'll put some of the outputs from these things up so you can see them as I saw them. Maybe eventually I'll figure out how to stream at a higher rate so images look better. But it's also fun to design, actually not to design for the compression, but to take advantage of the compression. But then I should be watching the feed and see where it's breaking down, and then we should program exactly for that. Maybe that'll be a future session. Yeah, it's really interesting just to push this thing kind of as far as it can go to just leaving artifacts. Now we're getting crazy structures. I'm going to rotate once in some other direction, or maybe I switch back to the 65 degree that we played with before, so these things have some perspective, and let them run across and do their thing. And then I'll save one of those images and maybe stop playing with these small particles that are hard to see. So if I turn off some of these rotations, turn the background back on, maybe disable this pulsing stroke and go back to just a white stroke. It might be interesting to put ourselves inside of that space and see what it's like. So I could rotate Y and say 90, maybe. -90, there we go. Yeah, that's creating an interesting kind of drunk wobble inside of a building, because we're staying inside of the box, but just from that rotation, the offset that they're making is keeping a trajectory towards the center, but everything is just allowed to wobble in just the right amount. It might be nice to let the stroke weight get thinner and thinner as it goes further out. Maybe the rotation, it might be nice to stay in this domain for a little bit and play with exactly how much rotation should happen. Maybe I need to slow down all the rotation. Where's our main rotation? It's this guy. Yep. It's this frame count here. Slow that down. There we go. Yeah, it looks like this could be the start of an interesting game where you try to walk through there and the shapes are falling up and down and left and right if you got a physics engine in there. Rotate even less. Or maybe even temporarily copy paste. Just play for a minute with the amount of the rotation in between it. Just to see how much each of these things offset and what that does. I'm sure there's nice relationships. Whoops, that was a lot. 25. How this thing just slowly twists. You might also want to keep the ones down at the other end a bit bigger. No, it's nice that they trail off like they go on almost forever. Have to see what this looks like from the side. Yeah, so that's interesting. But we're really just like inside this thing, but actually we're just a short ways in it. It's going on way further than we are, which means these things shouldn't be pushed quite so far into the distance. I think that's this guy here. Nope, it's this guy here, maybe, times I. Yep, it was that one. Yeah, there's way too many of these things, even though there's only 20. But as a box, they leave a lot of lines behind. So maybe we go back to our low poly sphere. Nope. Let's go to a torus. Torus, that is S map big by, I have no idea. Maybe it should be S map divided by 2 for how thick these things are. Let's make it low poly so the computer is happy. And these are all with the wrong rotation. We got these donuts. No, wait, I want to keep them as big as they are. I want to make them have more space in between. And they're all spinning around each other because they act differently than the boxes do. Interesting. So that is having such a rotation on them, doing a thing kind of orbing in and out. Could go back to having a fill. no stroke again, just the shading of these things. But we took away all this other rotation and such that had been there, so maybe some of that needs to come back and see what it can do for us. This maybe becomes one of those crazy roller coasters out there I have seen on the interwebs photos of, if it's real. Could leave a trace of these shapes. Don't know if it's worth it, but we don't know till we try it. They have a nice plasticity. Yeah, but it's kind of just chaotic rings spinning around. They need to be offset from one another, and I think that's where I took them away here. There it is, it's back. That they are allowed to spread out. Aha. Rotate Y. Interesting to try and keep a view looking down through the center of them. Yeah, I guess the torus has quite a different rotation than the boxes did. Maybe we need to let them change their fade constantly. Somewhere in here was that code. Reactivate this fill so that they get different fills and maybe slow that whole thing down. Now it's just way too fast. Yeah, what's it like when it's off to the side there? We've gone somewhere totally different, leaving less of a trace. I think a lot of this has to do with turning off these rotations that were spinning everything around for us. Oh, it's interesting, these moments, it gives this kind of faux 3D form depth, like we can look inside of the space. At the moment, they're all moving a bit too similar with each other. I think they've lost their own rotations. Whole lot of code that's been activated, deactivated. Yeah, it's really fun just using, save a shot. Using random shapes like a brush. What can you paint with a torus versus how can you use an ellipse to paint or a box to paint? What happens when I change the resolution of these things so they're finer, they're not so boxy. They'll probably leave slightly smoother images. Maybe I let the inside of them be thicker. Floating donut bagels. Or rings, or toruses, if we want to be precise. I'm making a logo I can sell to the Olympics later if I get them to configure in just the right way and I limit it to how many of them there are. And now we have to go through our various shapes that were waiting for us and see what change occurred through the other things that happened. Back to a low poly sphere. It was on a crazy different rotation. Interesting. There, it's nice that we can go for a split second. Ooh, that's nice. We can fall inside of some of these boulders, they almost look like, but they leave really nice shapes behind as a background when for a split second they create their own background. I have to try and line it up just right, but it keeps changing. I'm going to make this thing not get quite as big from the first one to the last one and have it get a little bit closer to each other. Not quite that close. I guess it was just for a split second that everything was all lined up next to each other nicely. There we go. It's asking to be some kind of caterpillar movement, so we are going to give some other shades to this thing. We've got this interesting sign happening here. I'm just going to do some quick copy paste and see what other values we can get to come out of this thing, other color ranges. Finish this episode in a colorful mode. We'll let that color finish. See what shades of can change the perspective. It's a question if the colors are fading in the right direction, if they should be going forward or backwards. Not quite sure. Whoops, now they're all the same. We're back to grayscale. That's something different there. Purple and green. That's probably closer to what a caterpillar would be like. And we can stop this rotation from going constantly. Leave it somewhere there and let this thing wander us out of this episode. Yeah, thanks for watching the last hour, messing around, improvising with shapes in P5Live. Hope you had fun. Hope you learned something. Join me next week. Be here Tuesdays at 9 o'clock Central Eastern Time. Central European Time. Yep. Catch you next week. Thanks for joining.